Hello and welcome to my latest video. In this video we're going to be using some more of the contrast paints that Games Workshop sent me. And I thought, being as in the previous video where I did the Imperial Fist Terminator, where I only used two contrast paints, I thought it'd be more interesting to try and use as many colours as possible. So I'm going to be painting this Gossamid Archer from the Echoes of Doom box. And you can see that I've already stuck the model together, primed it and given it a quick zenithal highlight. I used Wraithbone, just base colour. If you want brighter, cleaner colours, then I'd recommend just spraying the whole model white. And I think there is a new white scar spray that Games Workshop have done as well. But I decided to go instead for the zenithal spray purely because I wanted to get some focal points so I could focus more on the head and chest area, make those really bright, and then leave the darker areas because of the way that contrast works. Those will naturally stay darker as the paint overlaps them. So you can see here I'm using an Artist Opus size 4 brush, and the reason for that is just that I can really load it up and kind of get a lot of paint on the model quickly. Because what I'm going to be doing is trying to sort of blend the colours together while they're still wet. The effect that I achieved when I first tried this is kind of interesting, but I ultimately decided that I wouldn't use it. I'll explain why in a moment. But all I'm doing is using a few of the greens. Now, the main greens that I'm going to be using on this are Striking Scorpion Green, Karandras Green, and also there's Garaghak Sewer. It's sort of like a dirty colour, but it kind of gets the job done. It blends with the greens nicely. Now, what you can see is there's quite a stark contrast between some of the lines there. While the paint's still very wet, it's easy to just dip your brush in one of the other colours and blend them together. But because of the drying times, you kind of like risk messing it up and you'll get streaking. So as soon as you start touching the model and parts of the paint have started to dry, and it's going to mess up. And this is why I decided to ultimately not keep the results that I achieved here, because I actually kind of prefer the way it looks. It's kind of like a watercolor effect when you see it there. So there's some little sort of imperfections and dots and things, but that kind of like looked interesting in terms of an organic wing. But I was messing around with it too much. That you saw a little bit where there was a bit of a streak. Because of the way that I work, I'm used to just using like normal acrylics and then adding other colours, mixing them and layering on top. So it's very easy to correct things that I'm not happy with. In this case, sometimes there's a little bit of muscle memory going on and I'll be like, oh, I don't like that bit there, just use a brush to correct it. And then very easily you can mess up doing this because if it started to dry, it's just going to take the paint off and then you'll have like a hard line where you've around the area where you've removed the paint. And it's very, very hard to correct then because you can't add a layer of paint to go over that, because any area of paint where you go, so where the hard line is, you'll get some paint that goes over that, which will then darken that area. So even though you've got paint on the area that you've rubbed the paint off, that will then go to the correct colour. The area around it then becomes darker, so you still always have that little line around it. Whereas if you're just using normal acrylic paint, it's just very easy just to layer over that and you'll have no issues. But if you can work quickly, so you can see the right hand side, the wings there, they look a lot nicer than on the left. It's just a case of, so I hadn't tried this before. I just wanted to see how it worked. And just practice will get you where you want to be. However, after that section of the video, I tried going over some of the wing again, and I completely messed it up. So all I did was I went with the Striking Scorpion Green and I just airbrushed it on top of what I'd already done. And actually what you can see is it leaves an almost opaque layer. Like it took a couple of layers, but it really kind of it looks almost opaque. That so for airbrushing, in terms of like getting a smooth finish, it works very, very well. Now the nice thing about these contrast paints is that you can actually mix them with normal acrylic paints, and all I've done here is just added some white. So I've used P3 Morrow White, but it doesn't really matter too much what brand of paint that you use. So all I've done is, if you see the well palette there, just slightly out of focus to the right, one of the wells. This one here that I'm using, this has a small amount of white along with the striking scorpion green, and then below that the bottom well palette, well there on the well palette, that just has more white added. So I've got a 2-stage highlight that I can, for blending the highlights together. However, what I discovered was because and just keep in mind, right, so when you're using the contrast paint, and it's mainly contrast paint with a small amount of white or whatever color you want added, the paint is going to be quite thin and runny, although it does have a certain element of opacity. So you can see here as I'm painting it, it's very fluid, and it dries very smooth. Just remember that it's still going to be translucent, so the coverage isn't going to be great. The more normal acrylic paint that you add to this, the more opaque it's going to be, and the harder the mark you'll get. But the nice thing if you do it this way is you'll, if you just take your time, you'll get a really nice soft transition with hardly any brush marks to separate, so you can get a very, very smooth transition. But I did decide that I didn't want to spend that much time on this model. It's just a quick piece, having a bit of fun with the new contrast paints. So I eventually just went straight for using the striking scorpion green with the large amount of white added. I can't give you an exact amount. It's probably around about 50-50, but just check, see whatever color you get. If it looks something like that, that's the color to use. And all I'm doing is just painting the veins on the wings. I thought while painting these, it might be interesting to make them kind of look like a dragonfly. So I've got some reference for that. Now the only problem is that dragonfly wings are translucent or transparent in some cases, and so ideally you'd be able to see the wing behind it and everything through all the details. But I wasn't going to go to that sort of complicated level of painting. I just wanted to put some details on there. So all I'm doing is just painting on the veins that you would see. Obviously the wings already have some veins sculpted on, but if you look at like a dragonfly wing, they have a lot of veins all over. So all I did was just paint lines intersect, in between the sculpted on lines, so it's more detail basically just being added, and then do lots of little boxes. So they are roughly 4-sided, the lines for the veins on dragonfly wings, and I found actually that the shapes were quite simple to paint. I actually I made them more complicated than they needed to be. So I'd paint the little box and then I'd kind of go around the whole shape just to make them all connected a little bit more interestingly. So you can see there, going along the bottom again, making each box very definite. It's completely not necessary. If you just want to, do straight lines, and making a rough either rectangle or square each time you do it, you can do it very quickly. Now remember, it's just a quick gaming piece, so if you make the odd brush mark mistake here and there, it's not a problem really. No one's going to make notice too much on it. Here you can see I'm doing the same on the back as well, and again it's just painting a few lines on, kind of try and follow the sculpting that's already on there so that all makes sense. But having said that, you can have a few lines that, they can be a bit wibbly wobbly, a little bit, they don't have to be exact. You don't have to paint a very straight line. Just make sure you don't overload your brush. Now that line there is maybe a bit too much paint on it. I do recommend that you rub the brush off, the excess off on either your thumb or whatever that you have laying around. You could spend a little bit longer on it than I'm doing here. Some of these marks are really quite rough, but as long as you keep the brush that you use, so in this case I'm using a size 00. I'm trying to do it quickly, not I don't want to spend too much time on it, but here you can see what I was talking about, where I've just refined the mark that I'm doing, and it's just very quick straight lines. As long as you don't go over the lines, you'll be all right. These lines do not have to match up, so each time you do a separate box, the lines that you're doing, they don't have to match with the other one. In fact, it actually looks better if they don't match up. Each little section that you paint with all the lines is its own individual set of squares or rectangles. And I actually found that having less paint on the brush is actually more helpful on this. You can work a little bit better. So some of the lines may be a bit more faint, but that's not actually a problem. It just makes it look a bit more interesting. Because the organic nature of the wings, if you go and look at any reference, none of the veins are identical. It's all kind of like there's always little imperfections here and there. And just so having all these random lines, but with kind of obvious shapes, but that each shape is still not perfect. It all just makes it it all works together in a very nice organic way. And there you go. So what I did was I added a little bit more white to the previous Striking Scorpion green colour, and just picked out the sections on the wing closest to the body of the insect, just to push up the highlights a little bit. So now we're going to be painting the main body of the elf. I can't remember what they're called, but regardless, the contrast paints. I'm starting with Magmadroth Flame, and now this is a very strong colour. It's very bright. It's actually one of my favourite colours for the new contrast set. And you can see straight away as I'm applying it, super strong, but it's still working like the contrast paint should. So it's running into the recesses, and it's leaving the the areas with the most white on, the highest raised areas, are still a little bit lighter. So you get that highlight and shade effect still going on. So I'm using again a size 4 brush at this stage, but it's quite a small model. It's very fiddly. I will say at this stage, I really wished I hadn't glued on the bow, because it makes it very hard to get behind to paint the legs in particular. So I've swapped back down to a size 00 brush now, just so I can get around in there. The only issue with using a smaller brush is that you have to work a little bit quicker if you want to blend all the colours together, because again, anything that's drying, it won't blend quite as easily. Like if it's dried completely, you've got no chance of blending it, but while they're wet, it's very quick and easy to blend them together. In fact, it's easier to blend them like this while they're wet than it is like with normal acrylic paints, because they're so watery. They just instantly blend together. With a high pigment, you can see there, very quick, smooth blending. There's not a lot of effort really required at all. It's just mainly a case of making sure you cover all the areas. So here I'm using Baal red, again, really nice red colour. Probably would be quite nice for sort of a Blood Angel army, but it's a very rich red as well. If I was going to use something like this, you'd probably do that as like the first colour and then shade it down a little bit from there. I might have a go. I've already done a video painting a Horus Heresy Blood Angel at the minute, and he's much darker than this red, but it would be quite interesting to start with a really bright, vibrant red and then work backwards from it. It is one thing to try and get your head around as well while using contrast paints. If you mainly want to use contrast paints to paint a model, you are kind of working in reverse. So normally when I paint with acrylics, I start off with a darker colour and then I slowly layer up and highlight. So in that sort of sense, I'm painting with lights and creating shapes and things as I highlight up. When you're working with contrast paints, you can't do that. I mean, you can if you had white to it, so you saw when painting the wings. But if you're just using contrast paints, you don't have any of the paints, then you have to work in reverse. You have your most likely primed white model. You paint the colour on that you want it to be, and that will be whatever colour that you end up with there. That's as bright as it's going to get. That's your brightest highlight. And then from there, you have to just start shading everything down. And by that, you can kind of add darker contrast colours to the one that you've already used, or you can use some of the new shade colours as well. And I will be doing that actually a little bit later on to shade some of these colours, especially on the hair, which will end up again quite bright and vibrant. So here I'm using, I think it's Sigvald Burgundy. It looks like that. Again, a really lovely colour. A lot of these new contrast colours, they've got very strong pigment, really very strong colours, but they still work. You can still see it's going into the recesses. I will say, so I did choose to do the Zenithal highlight spray to kind of get the focal points on. So the head and chest area are going to be much brighter on this model, whereas the legs and things are not going to be as bright. But I'm going to be highlighting them up normally, the way I normally would by with normal acrylic paints later. But if you had just covered the whole model with the bright white spray to start with, then some of these colours, so you can see there the Sigvald Burgundy that I just used, it's a little bit darker on this particular model because the area that I've just covered is not quite as, it has less white paint on it. There's more of the black primer underneath showing. So here the last colour that I'm using on the legs is Garaghak's sewer. I've got to learn the names of some of these paints, and this is just a case again of just blending the paints in together while they're still wet. It's pretty straightforward. The only thing is, like, if you're in a really hot environment, then it's probably not the best to try this style of painting. So this is just me having fun, blending all the colours together. Again, just trying to see what sort of colours I can use on the model. But if you're doing this in a more traditional way, just painting the model with sections being a certain colour, so not trying to blend them all together, then you don't have to worry about any of these things. Just layer the colours on. Don't be shy to have a good amount layered on as well. The paint flows quite nicely, but it's not so wet that it's just going to completely flood everywhere when you apply it. So it's not quite as thin as a wash. It's not going to just instantly run into all the details. You do have a certain element of control over it. That's not to say, don't be careful. You definitely do need to be careful. It does flow. It is much thinner or more fluid than a standard acrylic paint. But, you don't have to worry too much that, just gently tapping the brush against another part is going to completely flood the area like it would if it was pretty much just water. So for the hair, again, I am going to transition some of the colours. Now, I've made a slight mistake here, and I opened one of the... Oh, no, I didn't. So this is Magmadroth Flame. Again, really nice, vibrant colour. I was going to say that I had opened up one of the shade colours. Now, at some point, I do, and it's the Casandora Yellow. And it basically looks kind of orange on the pot, so I wasn't paying too much attention. And doing this, mixing a shade with a contrast colour, that's a really bad idea because the shades are nowhere near as vibrant. There's not the pigment isn't the same sort of density, so the contrast will just massively overpower the shade if you try and mix them together in a transition like this. But you can see how nicely and quickly that blended together there. So, people want to know how to do wet blending. And, when you get the two colours and you mix them together, this is just a really quick method that's a lot easier to do. The only thing, so you can see that I've got all these pots open on the table there. You can do that. Clearly, that's what I've done here. But... you don't really want to cross-contaminate the colours. It doesn't matter so much if you're going from a lighter colour to a darker colour. It's still not ideal, but you're not really going to notice any difference in the colour. But if you go something from a really strong dark colour to a really light yellow, it's going to be much easier to sort of destroy the yellow colour. So it's probably better if you take the yellow and put it in a well palette or onto your wet palette and then work from there. Rather, if you're going to be dipping the colours together. Now the yellow, as you see it here, it looks a lot darker. That is because I, off camera, gave all of the hair a quick coat of Seraphim Sepia, so the new shade colour. The reason I did that was because the hair was really vibrant and yellow, and it stood out too much, and I just wanted to get to dull it down a bit and create a bit of shadow, a bit more contrast to it, really. Now, this is so I've kind of made it's not really a mistake, but I could have well, what I'm using is, so I'm using Flash Gitz Yellow. So it's a standard yellow acrylic paint, and just using that onto the wet palette there, around about 50-50 water to paint, and I'm just painting on the raised areas, adding a little bit of detail, a few extra hair strands and things, just to make the hair itself more interesting, and to help with light sourcing and, you know, all sorts of things like that. So there you go, just painting a little extra hair strands. And because it's had the Seraphim Sepia wash on it, it's dulled down a bit, so the Flash Gitz Yellow is now nice and bright in comparison. However, what I could have just done was use the Badmoon contrast yellow, which is what I'd previously used on the model for the hair, and just added some white to it. The reason I didn't do that was because so I wanted a yellow colour to start with as a base colour. You can't do that with the contrast because it's not an opaque or even slightly opaque colour really for layering on top of something. So this is where you need the standard acrylic paints. But like if I just added a small amount of white to it, it still would have been a little bit brighter. So probably Flash Gitz Yellow was the right way to go to start with. And then all I've done is added white to that. But because I was using Flash Gitz Yellow anyway, that's not a problem. And, that's probably the right thing to do. But on the other colours on the model, so like all on the skin areas, then all you need to do is just add white to it. Or if not white, like an off-white colour, you can use bone colours. Or if you want like a really warm model, you can add yellows, like yellow and a bit of white, preferably, because yellow generally is not a very opaque colour. But yeah, so you don't need lots and lots of acrylic colours, but it will definitely help if you're using contrast paint. If you want to push the quality of the painting a little bit higher by adding extra details or adding highlights on top of what the contrast has left, then it will be really useful if you get a white paint to add to it, because then you can do things like this, so you can add the extra details and the highlighting on there. But so as I mentioned, at this stage, this is just Flash Gitz Yellow from the pot, around about 50-50 parts water to paint. Then the next two colours below it, so again it's Flash Gitz Yellow, but it's probably closer to 50-50 white to yellow. I'm using P3 Morrow White. Again, doesn't matter which white you use. In fact, if you wanted, you could use Dawn Yellow as well at this stage if you don't want to mix any colours, although it is probably a good idea to practice mixing colours together, because it gives you a lot more options, and it's just an extra tool for you to work with. Then obviously at the bottom it's just plain white. So what I'm doing is going over the lines that I've already painted, just getting smaller and smaller each time, so I get like a nice sort of highlight shine onto the head there. Now, if you want, you can spend a little bit more time than I am on here. I'm mainly just focusing on the sort of the light volumes of like the big shine area on the head. So you can see there's that sort of really nice curve area. That's where I'm focusing on the highlights. Leave the roots darker. It creates the nice contrast. For the brush marks, pull the brush, if you can, always try and pull the brush towards you. That'll give you the straightest, cleanest brush mark. And make sure there's not too much paint on the brush as well when you're doing it. I'm just focusing here on the very front strands of hair that are right next to the face. This will create a little bit more of a high contrast area. Help with the focal points as well, because the face is obviously very covered, but people still want to look at the face. So having these bright highlights either side of it will just help draw attention to the face itself. So here we are up to the final highlights, and again, just going over what you've already painted. The two strands either side of the face obviously take a good amount of focus with the added white that I'm placing on there. But just going over again the areas that I've already painted. So it's not a case of you painting all of the strands on the hair, all of the hair on the head. It's just being a bit choosy about which areas you paint. so that you get the nice high contrast while still leaving some areas that haven't had a lot of paint added to them, which will then make the hair stay yellow. If you just highlighted every single part of the head, then obviously you're taking away yellow every time you go over it with a lighter colour, and then you're left with something that just doesn't look yellow anymore. Now we're going to be painting the skin. I'll mainly focus on the arm here because it's nice and clear for me to show you. So I'm using two colours here. One is the Magmadroth flame again. So if you remember, that's when I covered all of the skin on the chest area with that. But I've also mixed that with some Kislev flesh. So if you look on the bottom right of the wet palette that's in the top left of your screen there, you can see that's mainly Magmadroth flame, but it's got a small amount of Kislev flesh added. And then as you go up, there's more and more Kislev flesh until the top right of the wet palette, that's just pure Kislev flesh. Then on the top left, that's Kislev flesh mixed with some P3 Morrow White. One thing to note, as soon as you add the Kislev flesh to the Magmadroth flame, it loses some of the vibrancy. So you can see on the wet palette there, it looks a little bit sort of more dull. There's a few reasons for that. One, it is no longer translucent. It doesn't have the white base coat, so the really strong pigment doesn't get to show through either. And it just like dulls it all down a little bit, but that's not a problem because actually when you apply it to the model, it's still lighter than the plain Magmadroth flame that was added over the white or the Wraithbone base color. So even though the Magmadroth flame is more vibrant, as you add these colors on top, they're lighter, so there's more white pigment in them. And in some ways it's a shame because you're taking away from the really bright, vibrant color, but you're not covering the whole of the arms and the chest with these highlights. You're just picking the brightest places, or the places where the light is most likely to catch, and picking out details, making the model more interesting. But you'll still have the darker, the contrast paint, like the pure contrast paint, that's still in the shaded areas, like at the edges, just as it goes into the shadows. So you're still keeping the colour, but there's just not quite as much of it. Now it's purely up to you if you want to do things like this, so paint on top of the contrast paints. It obviously does mean that the painting is going to take a lot longer, whereas if you just covered the whole model in contrast paint and then left it, you still got something that looks quite cool, but it's obviously significantly faster to do. I just prefer to spend a bit longer on my models adding some detail, and indeed you can spend a lot longer on it than I am on this model, but I just wanted to kind of like show you what you can do with the contrast paints and then push them a little bit further by adding the extra details on top. Here you can see I'm just doing a bit on the face. The face on this is a bit tricky to paint because the hair is set forward over the face, so any kind of brush movement that you do, especially left or right, you have a strong chance of catching the hair that you've already painted. Now it's not that big an issue if you catch the hair. I mean, it's a bit of a pain because you painted it in contrast paint, and the problem is if you catch something that's been painted with contrast paint with a different color after it's already dried, you can't then go back with the contrast paint and paint over it to hide the mark, because the contrast paint would just sort of like make it darker. So what you will need to do is find a matching standard acrylic paint to go over that, or if it's a highlighted area, so if you've used contrast paint and then added a bit of white to it, so like I did on the hair, then actually it's really easy to fix because then it does have quite a high level of opacity already because of the acrylic paint added to it. So then you can just go over it with the highlighted colour and that'll fix any issues. So in this case it would just be a case of probably going back with the Flash Gitz Yellow, or some of the Badmoon Yellow contrast paint mixed with white. That would have fixed any issues. For the face, for picking out the highlights, it's fairly straightforward. Just look at how the light naturally falls on the face, but also take into account the fact that there's a lot of hair there that casts a lot of shadow, so you don't have to worry about painting the whole face, just mainly about picking out the cheek, the forehead and top of the nose. The main thing actually when painting the skin areas on this is to make sure you get plenty on the shoulder chest and upper arm area. So once you've spent a little bit of time painting all the flesh colours, you can see also, so I painted the clearly sort of humanoid arm, but on the other side, on the shoulder, you can see there's that sort of branch coming out of it. I painted a few highlights on that as well. And on the backpack bit, every now and then you can see a bit where I have missed slightly with some contrast, there's slight patchy bits. I do pick those up by the end of the video, so it all gets covered. It is one thing that I've noticed with contrast paints is that it's very easy to miss areas, because while it's all wet, you get a lot of shine reflection from lamps, so you can't necessarily see if it's like a white area that you're working on, whether it's a shine or if it's white, because everything just sort of looks the same a little bit, and it's not until it's dry that you actually can pick these areas that you missed out clearly. There are also so there's a thing with contrast paints. When you paint them on and while it's drying, depending on how well you've applied the layer of paint, as the paint dries you can get tiny little micro bubbles, and you won't see any of these while the paint's wet, but as it dries these will eventually pop, and then what you'll see is there's a little white dot on the model. So you might think, oh, I missed that, but I swear that I painted over that, because I asked about this at the contrast paints day while I was there testing out the paints. Because I've had this happen to me before, where I get little dots every now and then on the model where I swear that I covered the model with the contrast paint, and they were explaining to me, yes, it's because there's like tiny little micro bubbles, and these can be like from imperfections on the model, or like on the primer layer. They could be like certain things. They're really, really tiny. You wouldn't see them, but when the paint layer goes over it, it covers over it, but there's a bubble there. Then as the paint dries, the bubble pops, and then it leaves a little white dot there. But if you're just a little bit more vigorous and careful with your application of the contrast paint, you should then get the paint into those little imperfections, and you won't get the dots anymore. Or you can just be like me and put a little dot of contrast on top of them after it's dried. For the arm here, so if you remember, I used Sigvald Burgundy on the arm here. And I didn't follow my advice again. So what I should have done was added white to the Sigvald Burgundy, and I would have ended up with a really nice colour that looks a little bit different to this. So what I've done here is used Xereus purple and just basically painted over the top. So at the top on the wet palette there, it was Xereus purple, then a few stages of white added to it. So that's how you get that arm there on top of a Sigvald Burgundy base. But what you'll see towards the end of the video is the horns on the backpack that he has. I think it's a she actually, and it's not a backpack, it's actually part of her body. But the horny bits on the top, those were also painted with the Sigvald Burgundy, and I do actually just use the Burgundy mixed with white, and it gives a very different colour, much richer, nicer colour, and I would have preferred if I'd done the hand in that way as well, because I feel like the hand stands out a little bit in comparison to the rest of the model. But and I do actually at one point off camera go back a bit and try and glaze a bit of the Sigvald Burgundy over the top just to bring it back in again. Here you can see I'm painting the bow. Again, I have just gone for acrylic paints to paint on top. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. Like I keep saying that like it's a bad thing. No, this is how normally, if I'm using contrast paints, this is pretty much how I normally do it. I just use some of the other acrylic paints that I have so that I can use the contrast as a nice base, and the nice thing about the base is it does give you an element of highlight and shade already worked in there, so it just makes your life a little bit easier for working out where to place highlights. Generally speaking anyway, sometimes the contrast will go into a recess that you don't actually want to be dark, but it's not too hard to fix that kind of thing. But I keep saying, it's quite nice to add white to the base color for the contrast paints, because then you give an accurate highlight based on the base color. Now, I mean, it depends what you want. Adding other acrylic paints on top of the contrasts that are slightly different colors, you get a little bit more color variation. You can create some really quite interesting results doing it like that. But because I was trying to focus more on the contrast element for this video, like it probably would have been more useful for you just to see what happens by adding white to those particular contrast colors. and see how they highlight up, because there can be quite a large variation between what it looks like as the base color, especially some of the darker colors. They have, they're very pigment rich, and when you put them down, so you can see the color there, and they've gone into the recesses, and they're even darker in the recesses, and they're a little bit lighter on the higher raised areas. But as soon as you add white to it, some of those colors become like, quite striking, and you'll see that on, as I was talking about, the horns on the top of the model. Whereas on the bow here, you don't really get to see that as much, because I've used Rhinox hide, XV88 and Balor brown, and just mixing there some XV88 and Balor brown, not Balor brown, Rhinox hide, just to get a bit of a transition color as well. But yeah, I mean, that's just pretty standard painting and doesn't tell you that much about the qualities of the contrast paint. I'm just making sure like the model looks a little bit interesting for when it's finished. So at one point here as well, you can see me just going over it there, but I was going to start freehanding on some wood grain type effects on the bow, but then I started it, and then I just changed my mind straight away. Just thought I'd just keep it very simple. There's only so much time I want to spend on this model, and there's no point in painting detailed freehands all over it, or just making it more intricate than it needs to be, where I can just very quickly get the model finished while still showing like some nice contrast results. So there you can see I'm just using the final highlight on the bow with the Balor brown that I mentioned. By the way, the eye on the model, so you didn't see me paint that in. The nice thing about this particular model is it only has one eye, so it's probably a good model to paint the eye on as practice, because the eyes don't have to match. Sometimes when you're painting in pupils on eyes, it can be quite tricky just to make them match. So you might paint one pupil really nicely, then you paint the other one really nicely, but they can be looking in different directions, and then you have to repaint one even though you've done a good job in the quality of the pupil. Oh, and the iris as well, I guess, if you're just doing one dot. But because it's only got one eye on this model, and now, to be fair, there is a bit of hair covering over it, so it's not as easy as I make out. But you only have to do it once. You don't have to replicate that on the other side. Don't have to make sure it's looking in the same direction. So it is a nice model to have a go at painting an eye on, without worrying too much about making sure she's looking in the right direction. And when I painted the eye, so I just used the brightest highlight from the skin color. So it's not a pure white eye. I strongly recommend you don't paint the white of eyes on models as pure white. Humanoid, or just creatures in general, they don't have white for their eyes. It only looks white in comparison to the rest of the colors on the face surrounding it. Quite often people will use grey for like the white of an eye. But it doesn't matter too much as long as it's an off-white. And the reason for that is as well, if you want to put in a little shine dot at the end, then you can use a pure white shine dot, and that will then be brighter than the white of the eye surrounding it. So then it makes the reflection look nice and bright and wet, creating the higher contrast. Whereas if it was all like the whole of the eye was white to start with, then the white dot final highlight has less of an impact. Oh, and it turns out that I also lied about the final highlight. It's not Balor brown. I added a small amount of white to it, just off the camera at the side there. But just for the final highlight, I do take it up a little bit brighter there. So here you can see now what I was talking about, or you're about to see, where I used the Sigvald Burgundy mixed with white. So you can see straight away, look how lovely and rich that colour is. So I'm just putting it on very, very quickly here. A little bit messy, but if you imagine if I'd painted the hand in this colour instead of the much colder highlights that are on there from the Xereus purple mixed with white for the highlights. And also the nice thing about the Sigvald Burgundy mixed with white is it actually covers still really well. It's a lovely colour. It's closer to the reds. So it blends in better as well, whereas I feel like the hand sort of just is a bit obvious in how much it stands out. but at the same time, like it's all an experiment, this model. I don't generally paint like this in terms of using contrast paint. I mean, obviously for these colours as well, I haven't used them before as such for doing a finished model. So this is all like an experiment for me as much as it is trying to teach anything. So it is kind of interesting just to see the results, and then I can then add these what I learnt painting this to other models if I choose to go with the contrast route. So my paints have started to dry out a little bit here as well. By the time I was doing this, it was quite a hot day, and I was being distracted with other things while I was painting this. So the blending is a little bit rough there, but it gets the job done. I think you can see how thick the paint is. Like, I was being lazy. I just wanted to get this bit done quickly. I should have just taken the couple of seconds it takes just to add a little drop of water to those colours. But kind of like also interestingly, you can see as they dry how they look a bit different. So normal paint, when it dries, it just goes sort of opaque, whereas the contrast colours, when they dry, they're more like inks. So they keep an element of translucency to them when they dry. So here again we are using what's it? Garaghak sewer mixed with some white. This is and it's various stages. So these are all Garaghak sewer mixed with white on the left hand side. The top one only has a small amount added. Below that, I say roughly 50-50, but you might need to test it a little bit. And then below that, it's more white. You can have obviously more variations of shades and highlights added if you want to increase the amount of options for your transitions. The more colors that you have mixed between each color, the more transitions in between each color, the smoother the transitions will be, because there won't be a big tonal jump each time you add a new layer. For the legs here, as I'm adding the details, I'm just painting extra details on. It already has quite a lot of sculpted on detail. So there's like all sort of wood bark effect on there, and then I'm just adding extra ones on top, basically just to fill it in, because I don't want to spend time like blocking in all the raised areas. The contrast has already done like a lot of highlighting and shading for me, so I just feel like I can just add detail on top of it. I don't have to be spend my time just painting over what's already been painted in by the contrast. So it's basically just picking out detail that's already there. In some cases I'm extending the length of it where it connects to other things. So one element of the contrast is that obviously if it's in a recess area, then more of the contrast paint collects in the recess area and makes it darker. The only issue with that is that sometimes light will enter a recess area. So it might be a case of if you want something to be more of a focal point, or you've got a certain light direction coming, it's not so helpful that the contrast has gone into a recess. So in those cases, all you do is you just paint into the recess again. It's not that big an issue, but it's just something to be aware of. I mean, it's a general thing as well. Like, depending on the style of painting you want to do, obviously. Like if you're doing more of an heavy metal thing, that's not so much of an issue. Then you will focus more on raised areas and edges as highlight points. But if you're using light sources, particularly if you just want like a focused light source on the head and chest area and things like that, light will naturally go into so light goes in a straight line. If a recess is in line with the light source, then the light obviously goes into that recess, and actually the middle of the recess then becomes a highlight point, because the light is more focused in that point. So sometimes the contrast can have a negative element if you're using it for shading all the time, just relying on the way that the paint flows. So here you can see I've done quite a few layers on the legs already. I'm going to be painting the sort of vine thing coming out of the ground the same way. By the way, the leaf is actually painted with Mantis Warriors green, so that's another of the green colours. It's a little bit more yellow than the Striking Scorpion green, not quite as opaque either. I know it's a bit strange in terms of talking how opaque the contrast paints are, but some of them do have like really quite strong coverage, whereas other ones are not quite as strong, but they're all still very vibrant. It's just a case of if it's a less opaque version of the contrast paint, then what actually happens is that the finished result when it goes over a pure white coat is that it's a strong color, but it's not as light as the one that has less opacity. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So here we are. This is the sort of the finished result. And what I've actually done is given the whole model a layer of matte varnish, and I actually find this is really quite an important stage, because what happens with the contrast paints is that when they dry, they have kind of a shiny finish to them, and well, I mean, it depends if you like a shiny finish or not, but the problem is that because it's in the recess, especially that will be the most shiny, so that's where all the paint flows into, and so it means that this sort of the shadowy areas are then more shiny than the raised areas. So you don't get quite such an even finish on the model. I don't particularly like shine on the model at all anyway. So giving the whole model a coat of matte varnish just allows, like, it just evens up all the paintwork. And allows the actual painted on detail to show through, so you get a much nicer finish on the model. You can see there on the screen where I've actually glued the wings on, how it all works together now. And also I put some flowers on the base. I thought they kind of like mixed in nicely with the colours on the model. So now we've got something that's very nice and vibrant, a little bit sort of exotic. Might not be to your taste in terms of the amount of colour that I've applied to the model, but it was definitely sort of fun for me to paint, and quite an interesting experiment in terms of just painting everything with contrast and then seeing what I could do with the end result. But anyway, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe. I've got loads more content to come, and also don't forget that I have my own Patreon and my personal website with lots of other tuition videos, and the videos tend to be a little bit higher level in terms of the probably more focused for Golden Demon type things. But anyway, so that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.